So anyhow, I want to go ahead and just get started so that when he comes in, he can actually take over. Last time we talked about the ministry in the church, and I wanted to just do a short review of what we covered, just to set the groundwork for today. So we kind of addressed 4 questions last time, and the third one is I'm just wrapping up the very third one, which is why was there even an issue in the early church? And then we're going to spend most of our time on does the community of Christ priesthood structure match that of the early church? So one of the things that we talked about last time was Didache, which is the teachings of the 12 apostles, and it's a late first, early 2nd century document, not first-hand account, but it was used as a church manual. And so that's by way of preface of saying that we're going to talk about was support of our missionaries an issue in the early church, and as we discussed last week, it really was. What happened was it appeared from the writings and from our author's point of view that there were people coming from the Jerusalem church who were speaking under the Spirit and saying things contradictory to what Paul was saying when he founded the Gentile churches. And further, that there were other people coming in and claiming to be prophets and saying things because they knew that the early Christians were a very generous, open people. So the Didache, I skip a slide here. No, it didn't. Okay. Basically said, not everyone that speaketh in the Spirit is a prophet, but only if he hold the ways of the Lord. Therefore, from their ways shall the false prophet and the prophet be known. So in other words, by their actions, you can tell whether or not they're true or false. And every prophet who ordereth the meal in the Spirit eateth not from it, except indeed he be a false prophet. And every prophet who teacheth the truth, if he do not what he teacheth, is false. So we, in using reverse logic, we assumed that some people were coming in, claiming to be prophets, saying you need to put on a feast in celebration of the Lord, and they were participating in it. And so the Didache basically says if they request a meal, a banquet, they shouldn't participate in it. Whoever saith in the Spirit, give me money or something else, ye shall not listen to him. But if he saith to you to give for others' sake who are in need, let no one judge him. So if he's asking for things for others, that's acceptable. The last part of that question, dealing with whether there was a problem in the early church, has to deal with the wayfarer. And again, the early Christians had this reputation for being generous, of opening their homes and their meals to anyone who came. So by the late 1st century, early 2nd century, the Didache puts out this admonishment about the wayfarer. It says, but let everyone that cometh in the name of the Lord be received, and afterward ye shall prove and know him, for ye shall have understanding right and left. He who cometh as a wayfarer, assist him as far as ye are able, but he shall not remain with you except for 2 or 3 days. And it's the same admonition given for traveling missionaries and prophets. If need be, but for 2 or 3 days if need be. But if he willeth to abide with you, being an artisan, let him work and eat. But if he hath no trade, according to your understanding, see to it that, as a Christian, he shall not live with you idle. But if he will not do it, but if he will not to do, he is a Christ monger. Watch that ye keep aloof from such. And so it's again that the old, work. If you want to eat, you work. You can be a guest for a couple days, but after that, you need to work for your food and for your So that brings to the main topic for today, which is, does the Community of Christ priesthood structure match that of the early church? And I'd extend that to say the reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints evolved out of that church, that structure. So what's your answer?
Well, he's always told us that it is.
Okay, we were told that it is.
If I can be a little sarcastic, Jonathan,
Sure.
I would have answered this question differently.
We lost you. You just muted.
We can't hear you.
All right, okay, sorry, my cursor must have gone back over the mute button, I apologize. I said I would answer this differently before the church incurred $130 million retirement debt to support our retired appointees and so forth, which I don't disagree that they deserve that. But I think maybe there was some wisdom in having self-sustaining ministry that may have helped us had we done a little bit more of that.
Yep. Other comments?
Are you talking about the current policy of the church?
Well, I think he's talking about the fact that the church incurred a great deal of retirement debt for non-self-supporting.
Contemporaneous with.
Yes, yes.
Okay.
The church was not appropriately funding their defined benefit retirement account, I believe, for many, many years. And then when things got financially difficult, it caught up with us. And that's why we had to have this commitment to pay off $130 million.
Only 120.
And 120, sorry. What's 10 million here or there, right? And it's just, now we're in a situation where we've had to sell church properties and things that we maybe would like to not have sold, but I'm just saying it makes me more of an advocate for self-sustaining ministers, I guess. I see the value in what we do as volunteers.
Okay.
But I think your question is about the offices in priesthood structure, not the self-sustaining part. Really, I think that's what you were after.
Yeah.
Well, that's why the caveat was I said I was being sarcastic.
But Paul, we would expect nothing less from you.
And that is what Paul was saying to the patrines. It's like, this is a little dangerous
Yes.
to, he wanted to work for himself, either as a leather maker or a tent maker or whatever it was he did.
Right.
So he was saying, maybe it's not so great
Yeah.
to have the priesthood be dependent on church and church members. So I think that's a good point.
Yeah.
We were always taught that that's what it was.
Yeah.
I think I'm skeptical of that now. I think it was a fluid organization back then. I think we kind of locked in that Paul mentions all these offices, and so we should have all those. But I kind of think the structure was more fluid than we give it credit for 2,000 years ago.
Yeah. What was the structure 2,000 years ago?
Well, to start with, there was Jesus and there was 12, at least that's the way to say.
Yeah.
And then when Jesus was crucified, then, and there was
11.
all in 70s, but he sent out 70, so we have a 70.
Right.
But after he was crucified, then we had these 7 deacons, I think, in the Jerusalem church. That was a structure for a while. Those that were poor and needy. I don't know, it just see different things mentioned different places. So I don't know if there was a true structure. There was some kind of leadership structure, but
Okay. Well, let's go through and tell me first of all, before we go any further, tell me what our structure is today. What priesthood offices do we have?
Again, again,
What priesthood offices do we have today?
for offices,
You want us to list them?
you know,
Yeah. Yeah, list them.
Also,
Deacon, teacher, priest, elder.
Okay, deacon, priest, elder,
High priest,
priest,
teacher,
teacher,
deacon,
I would think so.
evangelist,
was-
apostle,
Evangelist,
evangelist.
president,
apostle.
bishop.
Okay, so does that list most of the offices?
Yeah.
And then we also have these additional, which I think hit most of those except the first presidency, which,
Yeah, no, Nadine said it.
oh, you
President.
did? Okay, sorry, I didn't hear you. Okay. So deacon,
I should have
teacher,
said 70,
elder.
but that was my father and I should have said, remember that.
Okay, patriarch, evangelist, Benedicts, apostles, bishopric, or bishops, and first presidency.
I'm glad she called it patriarch evangelist, because I actually don't like that the priesthood manual now just says evangelist, because we have women and they can't be patriarchs, obviously, that's a male term. They can be matriarchs.
There you go.
Exactly. I want it to be patriarch slash matriarch slash evangelist.
I wondered about that myself, why they didn't have matriarch, but
They didn't. They changed it just to evangelist, and those are two different roles, as our patriarch evangelist and Paul could say. Those are two different roles.
that might have been because of the abuses of patriarchal blessings. And maybe they were trying to, I'm speculating. This is
Interesting.
just off the
Okay.
But we
top of my
still
head.
have,
Alright.
we still have an evangelistic blessing.
We do.
We do, but they got into those issues of your lineage and all that created issues. I wonder if they wanted to steer away from that.
Oh, interesting.
Who's that talking about?
I wasn't told my
Jerry?
Sounded kind of like Dennis Wood.
No, my lineage.
I'm sorry, what was the last comment? Arlene?
You said something about Dennis Wood? Yeah, I think our church adopted the title of patriarch early on. That became kind of the designated word of patriarch, what they would call patriarch evangelist. But it did, I think, like Dennis suggested, it characterized kind of the wisdom of an older priesthood member by his life and years, you know, had achieved a place where he was considered kind of an overall father to the church. But in our own lifetime, that idea has, while it's hung on, has also given way to the idea that the function of the office is to be a good newser, to say the good news of the gospel,
Mhm.
and to have that attitude in his or her life and to portray it and to share it. And that was something the father figure was something, an invitation to see in the gospel of Christ the good news of all of our lives.
It's interesting, if you go back, it really is referred to as both evangelist, patriarch, even at the very beginning. So it's,
Wasn't Joseph
No, I-
Smith Senior the first?
pardon?
Wasn't Joseph Smith Senior the first patriarch?
Yes.
Yes.
Now, correct me, you can tell me.
Okay, fair enough.
I think that office has been dropped in the LDS church.
Which office?
Patriarch.
There's still patriarchs in the church, but they're all in almost a mission center stake level. That makes sense.
Okay.
Okay,
Well,
so
Do they give patriarchal
They
blessings?
do, yes. Like my grandfather gave me mine. He was a patriarch.
somewhere I thought that I read that kind of disappeared.
Untrue.
Okay.
Fair enough.
Okay.
Okay, well, let's take a look here. Let's take a look at the priesthood offices. Book of Hebrews says, for every high priest taken from among men is ordained. For every high priest taken from among men is ordained for men in things pertaining to God, that he may offer both gifts and sacrifices for sins. Who can have compassion on the ignorant and on them that are out of the way? And it continues on to talk about talks about Christ as the first high priest and says, called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. Okay, so that's in Hebrews in the New Testament. I'm not going to give you time to read these whole things. I'm just going fast.
Yeah.
There are in the church two priesthoods, namely the Melchizedek and the Aaronic. Agreeable?
Agree.
Okay, so that's where the name Melchizedek came from. It says in ancient time days called that priesthood after Melchizedek or the Melchizedek priesthood. And that was basically, again, it talks about after the order of the Son of God, but out of the respect and reverence to the name of the Supreme Being, to avoid the too frequent repetition of his name, they, the church in ancient days, called that priesthood after Melchizedek. And that's from Doctrine and Covenants, section 104, and I think it's 107 in the LDS Doctrine and Covenants.
Jonathan, when was Hebrews written? Was it after Paul? Or, I mean, somebody tell me the
Yeah,
I
timeline.
believe
So
it was.
Paul, it would have been during Paul's time then?
After.
I think it's after. I think it
After. So
follows.
I'm just wondering if Paul knew about this structure.
Well, we'll see.
All right.
We'll see. Okay. So this is just to identify that there is in
Yeah.
fact the Melchizedek priesthood. And it also, I'm sorry, I skipped the part that talks about the Aaronic, the Levitical priesthood. So here's
Yeah.
the two priesthoods and that
Yeah.
mentioned. So then in the book of Acts, and when they, Paul and Barnabas, had preached the gospel in that city and taught many, and it continues on about the healing and exhorting them to faith and all. And when they had ordained them elders in each church and had prayed with fasting, they commended them to the Lord on whom they believed.
All right.
So every church had an elder. Okay. So that much we
Okay.
sort of in sync with. The office of an elder comes under the priesthood of Melchizedek. The Melchizedek priesthood holds the right of presidency and the power and authority over all offices in the church in all ages of the world to administer in spiritual things. The presidency of the high priesthood after the order of Melchizedek have a right to officiate in all the offices in the church. So an elder can basically function in all offices in the church. Okay.
Yeah, I didn't realize that the category is high priest and that the elder is in the category of
Within
high
the
priest.
umbrella.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until I read my priesthood manual again.
Yeah.
It's like, oh,
Well, I think what you're saying is the high priest's
I'm
special
talking about it
function
today.
of the office of elder.
say that again?
I think what you're saying is that high priest is a special function of the office of elder.
Exactly.
And the advice given when somebody is going to be ordained a high priest is be late to the meeting.
Dorothy.
Be late to a meeting.
It just comes with the territory.
Yes, because if you're on time, you'll have to preside over the meeting.
Oh, I see. Okay. I
Fine.
I didn't run across the scriptural reference to that.
It's,
It's right here in Hebrew. It's right here.
Right, okay. Okay, maybe I
That's
just
why they had to have priests.
I tried to
That's
do a
right.
good survey of all the
That's
priesthood
good.
mentioned, but I may have missed that one.
I thought she was saying, because I was late.
you went to the
I don't think it was personal.
elders class or high priest class.
Okay, so then the Doctrine and Covenants 104 continues. High priests after the order of the Melchizedek priesthood have a right to officiate in their own standing under the direction of the presidency in administering spiritual things, and also in the office of an elder, priest of the Levitical order, teacher, deacon, and member. And I think it's interesting to note that member is included along that.
Yeah, I like that.
An elder has a right to officiate in his stead when the high priest is not present. So again, come late. Maybe that's the basis. Come late to the meeting so you don't have to preside if you're a high priest. Yes, Jerry.
I think
Paul
one
Bennetts
reason
is
the
our high
term
priest.
member is included
He's
in all
also
of
an
that
evangelist.
is it carries out the understanding that every member of the church has a function of evangelizing in a sense, of sharing the good news. And so I think it's interesting, but also important that member is attached on there so that no one is without an opportunity
And that's what he said to me to convince me to become a priesthood member, by the way.
I see.
I don't know if you remember that, Jerry, but I didn't, I fought against being a,
I remember arguing with you about whether you were going to accept your call, and I
Yeah.
told you, you better do that.
you did. And you pointed out to me, and this is what kind of convinced me, it's like, Jane, a member is an important role too. And you're already acting, you guys are actually taking exactly what I'm going to say in church today, by the way.
Oh, sorry.
You know, a member, you said to me, and I think this about everyone who is called to a priesthood, you're already acting in that priesthood office because that's what your gift is. And so when you said that to me, I was like, okay, fine, I'll go ahead and do it.
It's profound.
I know.
Yeah, inspired.
But to include a member, when we're talking about priesthood, emphasizes that every person in the church has an opportunity and a responsibility to share the good news that's come to that person.
Absolutely.
It's incredible.
This scripture basically says that member is one of the offices within the church.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Well, I love that you took the time to talk about this with today's message and ordination. It's so timely. So
Mhm.
thank you.
Yeah, I don't really have to say anything. Except Karen's not here.
you say, you miss it in class. Sorry.
Sorry, Karen. She's gonna be an elder. So-
Okay, then continuing, the high priest and elder are to administer the spiritual things agreeably to the covenants and commandments of the church, etc. But, you know, again, we have in that then deacon, teacher, member, priest, high priest, elder. I mean, it covers most of the offices we have in the church and in Doctrine and Covenants 104. The Didache says, appoint therefore for yourselves bishops and deacons, worthy of the Lord, men meek and not lovers of money, and truthful and proved, for they also render to you the service of prophets and teachers. Despise them not, therefore, for they are your honored ones, together with the prophets and teachers, and reprove one another not in anger, but in peace, as you have in the gospel. And again, it continues on. So there in the Didache, again, that late 1st century, early 2nd century document, it talks about bishops, deacons, prophets. So
Teachers, I don't, do the other Protestant churches have the office of teacher like we do?
I don't know that it's an office.
Okay.
I mean, I know they have teachers. They always
Yeah.
have Sunday school teachers.
Sure.
That's it. So,
No, the Methodist Church doesn't.
Doesn't-
It sounds like, this, Dennis, for those on Zoom, it sounds like bishops and deacons function in a way as prophets and teachers in that first phrase there.
well, if you read about the early Christian church, many articles talk about really 3 offices. That of the elder in each congregation or in each church, the deacon who deals with the temporal kinds of things, and the bishop who is kind of the overseer. So, you know, in many cases, there's no reference to other offices other than those 3.
And the way I remember it is that in Acts, the first one that's mentioned is Stephen and the deacon, as a deacon, and that's before any elder is mentioned.
Yeah.
They choose 7 men to administer the funds, and they're deacons.
Right. Well, keep in mind that in the early church, the original authority, of course, was Jesus. Once he was crucified, it was the apostles who held that, and the people who were family members. So it really, there was a need for a deacon to handle the temporal affairs because you had prophets. You had apostles who were in fact providing the spiritual ministry.
I have always wondered why other churches, this is why, you know, like what you're saying, when I was growing up, it's like Joseph Smith restored the church because there were in fact apostles in Jesus's time. And I've always wondered why other churches didn't have apostles,
Yeah.
you know? So it's like, that makes sense to me.
They call them different things.
Well, I know that the Catholics have bishops.
They have cardinals. that are
And
apostles.
cardinals are apostles. Oh.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know that. I didn't know the cardinal was an apostle.
They don't call them that, but it's
Okay.
obvious to the casual observer that that's the function.
They don't call themselves that.
No,
Okay.
Just to take a speculative view again. One side of the apostles kind of said you had to have known Jesus personally, physically.
Ah.
And when they died off, maybe
Ah.
that was the elimination of the office.
Okay.
That was a charge, that was a charge against Paul.
Yeah,
You
right.
never
That's
knew
right.
Jesus when he was alive,
That's right.
and so you're not really an apostle. I mean,
That's
that was
right.
one allegation.
Right. Exactly. And the
It was a Peter's
apostles
point, wasn't
had to travel with their wives and were taken care of by the church. And Paul, of course, was going out there working on his own, basically as a tent maker, leather maker, whatever.
it? Well, again, that's why it's a restoration church, right? A
Yeah.
restored church.
That's
Right.
Maybe that makes us Pauline also. 'Cause
Okay, so Doctrine and Covenants talks about the second priesthood is called the priesthood of Aaron because it was conferred upon Aaron and his seed. And it goes on why it is called the lesser priesthood because it is an appendage to the greater of the Melchizedek priesthood and has power in administering outward ordinances. And it goes on to say that the bishopric is the presidency of this priesthood and holds the keys and authority of the same. No man has a legal right to the office to hold the keys of this priesthood except he be a literal descendant of Aaron.
Yeah, that's the biggie, the whole descendant thing.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah. So,
That's why all the patriarchal blessing needed to have
Give
the
lineage.
to lineage,
Yeah.
because it's like, you gotta trace it back to,
well, and it's also, I think, true that we have tried to diminish that statement about the Aaronic priesthood being the lesser.
Hmm.
Because we've talked more in recent days about all priesthood offices being unequal power, even though there is an organizational structure, but so then we go to the New Testament, 1 Timothy. This is a true saying, if a man desire the office of a bishop, and King James Version that Joseph Smith would have had access to says bishop. The new NIV, New International Version, says overseer. And so you find that terminology used in different versions of the Bible. So if a man desire the office of bishop, overseer, he desireth a good work. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach, not given to wine, no striker, not greedy of filthy lucre, but patient, not a brawler, not covetous.
Mhm.
And it goes on and on. I just think all those descriptions are quite interesting. So, and again, using reverse logic, there must have been some men who didn't quite qualify as bishop because they had more than one wife, or they weren't,
they brawled.
yeah,
were
they brawled,
boxers.
yeah,
or they didn't know how to rule their own home.
yes.
No, it's
I
a
thought that
political
was-
office, not a religious one.
Yeah, that's an interesting phrase too. One that ruleth well his own home, having his children in subjection with all gravity. For if a man know not how to rule his own house, how shall he take care of the church of God?
Yeah.
So good luck to a lot of us.
Yeah, well, that one, that lasted a long time in our culture.
Yeah. So then in 1 Timothy also, it says, likewise must the deacons be grave, not double-tongued. What's double-tongued?
Two-faced.
Forked tongues.
Speak with forked tongue,
Yeah,
talking out of both sides of the mouth.
right. Liars,
Yeah.
yeah,
We
etc.
know, we know
Yeah.
double tongue.
Not given to much wine, not greedy of filthy lucre, holding the mystery of the faith in a pure conscience. And that these also first be proved, let them use the office of the deacon, being found blameless. Let the deacons be the husbands of one wife, ruling their children and their own house as well, etc., etc. So that's all New Testament. I don't know why there's these chuckles about all these descriptions.
Especially with Russ and Dorothy right there. Okay, who rules that house?
Everybody knows the
We
kids
go on to elders. Let's see if elders have it any easier.
Any easier.
The elders which are among you, I exhort, who are also among you. Let me start over. The elders which are among you, I exhort, who am also an elder. So this is Peter talking in a book that's typically attributed to Peter, and he's saying he's an elder and a witness of the sufferings of Christ, and also a partaker of the glory that shall be revealed. Feed the flock of God which is among you, taking the oversight thereof, not by constraint, but willingly, not for filthy lucre, but of a ready mind, neither as being lords over God's heritage, but being examples to the flock.
What's the filthy lucre?
I don't,
thing?
I was gonna ask the same. I don't know what lucre is.
Well, it's money.
Money.
It's
But
just
I wonder about
plain
dirty
lucrative.
money,
They
dirty money.
gotta launder it so that it's not filthy.
Probably ill-got gains.
Yes.
Ill-got gains.
Yeah. That's
Launder, so basically launder the money is what they're telling us to do. Great.
I don't think it's meant.
I go to the laundry every so often. I do too, find a dollar bill.
Oh my gosh, that is so funny.
Yeah, the dollar bill goes through the laundry too many times. It's hard
It's
to
lucre.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Ephesians, again, I'm trying to show,
There we go.
I'm all, so about 7 minutes overtime for poor
Yeah,
Dennis.
you just never, yeah. I don't think, let's just finish Jonathan. So
My
you can have
apologies,
next
Dennis.
week.
I'm not gonna be here.
Oh,
next week.
shoot.
You can teach me.
So anyhow, in Ephesians, unto every one of us is given grace according to the measure of the gift of Christ. And he gave some, and I inserted to be, because I think it makes it clearer, some to be apostles, and some prophets, and some evangelists, and some pastors and teachers, for the perfecting of the saints, for the work of the ministry, for the edifying of the body of Christ, till we all come in the unity of faith and of the knowledge of the Son of God, unto a perfect man, unto the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ. So
Okay.
here again, we have each of these listed, including pastors in this particular case. And then in Luke, and I think Dennis, somebody mentioned already, after these things, the Lord appointed other 70 also, and sent them 2 by 2 before his face into every city and place whither he himself would come. Therefore said he unto them, the harvest truly is great, but the laborers are few. Pray ye therefore the Lord of the harvest that he would send forth laborers into the harvest. And basically, this is the basis for, I haven't found another reference to 70. I think this is the primary reference in this event of our establishing 70s who are supposed to go 2 by 2 to minister. So let's see. I'm going to skip this because this basically talks about, again, that they should be laborers, heal the sick. And in fact, after this verse, what I didn't include, it talks, is the one you've heard many times about how if they go into a town and the town reject them, they shake the dust of that town off of their feet and go on to another place. So Doctrine and Covenants 104 says the 70 are also called to preach the gospel and to be special witnesses unto the Gentiles and in all the world, thus differing from other offices in the church in the duties of their calling, and they perform a quorum equal in authority to that of the 12 special witnesses or apostles.
The quorum of 70.
Yeah.
You know about that?
And ideally, there's supposed to be how many quorums of 70? Seven
Quorums
quorums
of 70.
70.
Are there 70 people in each quorum? Or were there at first? Because now we've got what got big. Obviously.
Well, they're not full. I'm not,
Yeah,
I don't
They're
know.
not full.
they're supposed to be
Okay,
70 times 7.
okay.
Yes.
Does the church still fulfill that today?
I don't know how full our quorums of 70 are. I don't think they're.
I'm pretty sure they're about like half.
Yeah.
I think there are some vacancies, but there are still 7 different.
Yeah.
quorums.
There are 7 quorums. And there is a head of each quorum, but they are not full.
Nadine, was your dad a 70?
Yes. He was, and I found out doing our family tree that his third great grandfather was also. So kind of cool.
Very cool.
I thought there was a document recently, and by recently, I mean in the last decade or so, where the church was called upon to work on filling the quorums of 70 again. Does anybody else remember that?
I do remember that. I'm not sure which section of the
Yeah.
DNC, but
But I don't think, I agree with Nadine, I don't think it's happened yet. I mean, I think there are more 70 than we had. We only had 100 and some for a while, out of the 490 we were supposed to have.
I don't think that was meant to signal the end of class.
My dad was a 70 while he was under appointment too. That was one of his callings, I guess I would say. And he mainly was a missionary and traveled a lot
Dave
for
Ettinger,
that.
he was, or here was a 70, wasn't it?
Dave Edinger? I don't know. Paul, was David Edinger a 70?
He might have been.
David Shobar was.
David Edinger was, yes, he was a 70, I believe. I think he was a 70 maybe when he applied for the job of pastor at Mission Road, and then went on to Omaha Council Bluffs stake and served as a 70 there, maybe a stake president or something.
I think
we have
Bruce Darrington was, and I believe that, and I know that Dave Shobar was.
Yeah, so that was very common for the 70 to be, you know, kind of the stake presidents. And now when Gary Logan was stake president, he was a high priest. So it didn't always hold true, but I think for a lot of the districts in the church, when we had the district and stake system, I think a lot of those were 70. And I think we have a lot more volunteer 70 now than we used to have. It used to be that was kind of an employed office in the church, and now I think that it's mostly a volunteer office or a self-sustaining office.
John Pennington was a 70.
That's what I was wondering, if most of the 70s that we're talking about were also appointees. That was kind of system for a long time.
Yeah, back in the day, that was true.
Yeah.
People like Joe Bayless and different ones, you know, were 70s.
Well, so answer the question. Does the Community of Christ / RLDS priesthood follow the same organization as the early church?
I would say so.
Pretty darn close.
I would agree. Yes.
Could you repeat that?
Does the Community of Christ / RLDS church follow the organization of the early Christian church?
It's certainly trying to.
I think as Joseph Smith understood it, we did.
Agree.
I'm not sure that his understanding was in agreement with what other scholars and people would say that understand the New Testament, but I think as he understood it, that's what he was trying to do.
He certainly had biblical references for every office he created in that original organization of the church.
Yeah, it seems to me it's a double answer to that, in part yes and part no. There's a basic structure, yeah, there are similarities and features that say we match the early church. In other instances, you'd say, but no, we had a dysfunction. I'm trying to think of any office that may be new to and then I don't know. But I think the answer is yes and no to the question.
Again, there's at least a reference to every priesthood office within the New Testament. So. Okay, Dennis has all of 15 minutes.
Yeah, I gotta go.
Do we have Sunday school next week with the community?
Say what?
Do we have Sunday school next week with the community?
Next week is not Easter.
Oh, that's right, it's the week after. My weeks are.
Yeah.
Easter feels later this
Okay,
year.
we're on chapter 12, phasing of the future. The already versus not yet struggle continued. in Paul's estimation, this put his mission in jeopardy, and he wanted to stop it. He said that, it led to the impression the church was full of idlers. There's a saying, the devil finds work for idle hands, and he said that this led to people being led into sin. So he attacked the Petrine position, and find this in 2 Thessalonians, and this is, I'm not going to read all this in chapter 2, but basically he breaks this down and saying, well, this has got to happen and this has got to happen before the kingdom can be here, as the Petrines say. So there's certain things that have to take place. And he says, evidently somebody had written a letter purporting to be from Paul, and he says, don't be taken in by this letter. But he talks about a rebellion has to come, and the man of lawlessness must be revealed, and then he will exalt himself, and then he will claim to be God. And he says, I told you this, don't you remember? And this lawless one will be revealed, and then he will be destroyed. So he basically says the already view is not correct. We're now is the time. This is about 51 CE according to Goulder. We're in a kind of a pause phase. The man of lawlessness is yet to be revealed, and also then destroyed. So we're only in phase 1, not phase 3. So how did Paul come up with these 3 phases? We got them from the book of Daniel, according to Goulder. Daniel was written as if it took place 400 years earlier than when it was actually written, which gave Daniel the opportunity to make his prophecies come true since they had already occurred. Paul takes these prophecies and applies them to his own time. And Goulder says he took this course of action one time, but others followed up later doing kind of a similar thing, according to Goulder. And today people read these prophecies as being about our time. Anybody want to comment on how they approach these prophecies? Did Paul take a wise course when he chose to apply Daniel's prophecies to his time, which was a bit later?
What's your point? Did Paul refer to Paul?
Yeah, Paul used the prophecies of Daniel and said, according to Daniel, these events have to occur before the Lord comes again, and some of these things have not yet happened, so we cannot be, as the Petrines believe, that the kingdom is already here. That's not yet, in his opinion. So, because of the phasing of events. And for Paul and his followers, this proved the Petrines were deluded in thinking the kingdom is here when it really isn't. But that wasn't the end of the problem, even though they thought Paul had proved it was. 20 years later, Mark sees the same issue, and in chapter 13, he addresses that. And in chapter 13, if you look at that, Jesus issues a prophecy of what's to happen. And interesting, Goulder says, future happens in 3 phases, just like it happened with Paul. And where did Paul get his 3 phases? Goulder says from Daniel. And Goulder compares chapter 13 of Mark and says it's very close to the structure of Thessalonians and also the structure of Daniel. So Mark, in Goulder's opinion, is a very good Pauline. There is one thing he notes that is not in Daniel that, or Thessalonians, that's in chapter 13 of Mark, and this is the persecution paragraph, which he links to Paul's suffering. Mark being a good Pauline according to Goulder. It's interesting though, at this point when at least the common belief is that Mark was written after the destruction of the temple at the end of the Jewish war with the Romans. And this marked the end of phase 1. And Mark is saying, okay, phase 2 is about to begin, get ready. Any ideas why you think Mark had Jesus making this prophecy in his chapter 13? Some of it's kind of, he might have had some other reasons besides being a good Pauline, you think?
Well, it wouldn't be unusual for Paul to refer back to Daniel because they were good Jews, and therefore for Mark to reflect that also.
Okay.
I mean, it'd be part of the tradition that they would both be aware of.
Okay, they were knowledgeable of Daniel, certainly. Goulder makes the statement that Paul knows Daniel better than we do.
Well, doesn't it also add legitimacy to Jesus Christ and his ministry? I mean, isn't that why to answer your question, I guess, maybe I misunderstand, but why would Mark want to have Jesus prophecy at the end of times? It's adding validity to Jesus being the Savior.
Okay, how does it? How do you think it does?
Well, because it's announcing or proclaiming these prophecies, right?
Okay.
The coming of the Son of Man,
Okay.
the Son of God, in my opinion, or what I read.
Okay.
I might be way off then.
Well, let's move on.
Okay, fair enough.
We'll give you a second shot at this.
I appreciate it.
Okay, so this is Goulder's conclusion. The cumulative effect of these parallels between Daniel and Mark and Paul, or in Thessalonians, he suggests that Mark really didn't have a tradition of Jesus actually saying this about the future. He has this Pauline tradition. That's Goulder's position. This leads into a point that Goulder makes, that prophesying is a dangerous profession. And the danger is what happens, what difficulties do you have when a prophecy is not fulfilled? And this is where he thinks that Revelation, the book of Revelation, deals with the problem of Jesus' prophecy not being fulfilled immediately after the desecration and destruction of the temple. That was the end of phase 1. So phase 2 didn't happen immediately. So Revelations addresses that. He says Revelations is an extended form of chapter 13 in Mark, and he starts aligning events. He aligns events in Revelations with events in chapter 13 of Mark. Phase 1 correlating to the four horsemen correlate phase 1 with wars and rumors of wars. He thinks the beast correlates with the man of lawlessness in phase 2, and then these bowls of blood and darkness and our first part of phase 3, and then Christ coming on a white horse is the second part of phase 3. One thing he says John the Revelator does is split phase 1 in 2 phases, A and B. This is the 7 seals and 7 bowls, and I'm not an expert in all this stuff, but I don't even claim to be. But he does this, according to Goulder says he does this because the man of lawlessness has not taken, the oppression of the man of lawlessness has not taken place. So he thinks there needs to be kind of an interval in here to allow for something to happen because it hasn't happened yet. For John, this allows this time to develop. And I think this is important to John because he wants to maintain the validity of the prophecy. And if the prophecy is going to go, this appears not to be fulfilled, then that's going to create questions about Jesus' prophecy. So in Revelation, that's Goulder's. Goulder thinks that he thinks that John the Revelator thinks Nero is the first beast and Titus is the second beast. Nero committed suicide, but there were rumors that he survived, and there's a reference in the book of Revelations that the first beast suffered a mortal wound, head wound, but then he was healed. Some people think this has to do with Nero, but he really didn't survive. So I wondered, this is me speculating because I claim I'm no expert in Revelations, but did the second beast account for Nero dying? And why did John think that Titus was the second beast, as Goulder claimed? Well, Titus was the general who was commanding the armies that captured Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. That seems to me to must have fulfilled part of this prophecy. So he would be considered this beast, man of lawlessness, because what he did with the temple. Interesting though, Titus died after a couple of years, and he was not destroyed by the breath of the mouth of the Lord as the prophecy states. So what do we make out of all this? 1900 years or more later, since John the Revelator extended the time frame, by Goulder says a decade, to account for this delay in the man of lawlessness, and we're still waiting for Jesus to return. So that changed anything?
Well, you're adding good. You're adding to it. Yeah.
He didn't extend it.
Yeah.
In Goulder's opinion, I don't think he extended it 1900 years. So where are we at?
You remember we studied this thing?
I wasn't here when you did that. So
Well-
if we have an expert over here, I'd say.
No, we don't. I haven't read it for a long time. So, but you know, it really does talk about the book of Revelation being 4 different interpretations, if I can remember them. One is the preterist, that it basically has already occurred. One is that it occurred around the time, shortly after the time of Christ. One historical that, you know, happened before that. One was, it's all spiritual. One that is apocalyptic coming up. So that's probably a poor explanation of the 4, but basically scholars basically view there 4 different approaches to the book of Revelations, which ties in with what you're talking about.
And it looks like Goulder took the approach that the prophecy was about what was happening and events of that time, so that it would make whatever the prophecy was, the people understood it and could apply it to the situation, which I kind of can support, because what's a prophecy do for people 2,000 years ago? If it's way in the future for them, they needed some immediate assistance. It would be my leaning, and I think that's what Goulder's taking, but other people would take another approach, right?
You know, there's been a lot on TV, like on Channel 19 and stuff, about Nostradamus and his prophecies, and that some of them are coming true at this time. So, you know, he lived a long time ago, and his prophecies are supposedly just now coming true. So, you know, just prophecies for the future.
I think the main, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the problem with prophecies is that quite often multiple events can meet the qualifications. For instance, you talk about there being rumors of wars and rumors of wars. When has that not happened?
Yeah.
Talk about, and I don't remember the exact wording, but basically it amounts to young people not respecting their elders. When does that not happen? So yeah, I'm not disclaiming all prophecies. I'm just simply saying you have to be careful in interpretation.
Well, Goulder points out, he says, Paul used this technique one time. And I don't know my scriptures well enough to say, to point to someplace else where Paul did it, but I don't know if Paul thought he might have got himself into trouble with using his prophecy, because there are the dangers of taking this prophecy from Daniel and applying to your time, and then if things don't work out, then people ask, well, what's going on? Why wasn't this prophecy fulfilled? I can see some dangers, but Paul's main point, what he was really trying to get to, was the kingdom is not yet here, like Petrine's claim, and he saw that as a challenge to his mission, and because of what the Petrines were doing with, and we've already talked about this, the way they used the gifts of the Spirit, and he thought they were busybodies, idlers, and it wasn't going to lead to the church continuing to grow, that this was not a long-term way that they could function the way the Petrines were functioning. So I will end it there, I guess.
Yeah, and Paul put in the chat, also from the book of Mark. However, no one knows the day or hour when these things will happen, not even the angels in heaven or the Son himself, only the Father knows. So
I've always had a kind of problem with because Jesus says things like that, which makes sense to me, but then you have a prophecy where he says, but this is going to happen, and it's kind of like there's some conflicting opinions about what Jesus says one thing, but then he also says something else, which seems to fly in the face of him saying nobody knows except for the Father.
Yeah. Well, and I think Goulder in this book does a good job of explaining that there really are two different missions. There's the Jerusalem mission, or the Petrine mission, and there's the Pauline mission, and that they were at odds sometimes. And so if a gospel follows Paul, then you would get some different views. So,
and that's all assuming if you take Goulder's thesis, that these were two different missions, versus you don't take Luke's position that it's all peace and harmony.
Right.
And I think Jesus' point too was, don't spend a lot of time getting caught up in prophecies and trying to predict dates. Because if you say that's going to happen on April 6th, 1823 or something like that, and then it comes and goes, and then we're still trying to interpret the prophecy in light of our circumstances in 2022, which is what a lot of TV preachers do with the book of Revelation.
Yeah.
And so they'll make a prediction and make a lot of money off of it, and it doesn't happen, and then they just have to revise the story and come back and preach another sermon.
Right.
Well, we're out of time.
That's the condensed version of chapter 12. So.
Thank you, Dennis.
Thank you all.